Thank you, Alex. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this morning as we are going to discuss race, equity, intersectionality, and mental health at work. My name is Amma Afrifa-Chi. I'm Head of People, Wellbeing and Equity at Mental Health First Aid England. Alex, you want to go to the next slide, please? And this is one of many webinars that we have hosted. We actually started our webinar series last year following the murder of George Floyd, looking at how you support the mental health and well-being of Black people and people of color in the office, but also how to become an anti-racist organization. And why it's so important to us is we actually started this journey, as I said, last year, when we made our commitments to becoming an anti-racist organization in July. And following on from that, we have released several resources, this webinar being one of them, free guidance around how we can support that, how you can support people of color and Black people in the workplace, but actually what it means to be truly an anti-racist organization. But actually, funny enough, we began our journey in a very, I guess, indirect way with our My Whole Self campaign. So we launched My Whole Self back in 18th of March, where we actually were talking about real culture place in terms of workplace culture change around fusing well-being and inclusion as part of an agenda when you look at people experiences and what it actually really means to truly advocate a health place that is a workplace that is healthy, a workplace that tries to eradicate the stigma around mental health and well-being, and more so thinking about how you connect diversity and inclusion with well-being, and what does that look like in a truly holistic approach when you're thinking about the workplace cultures that you are building in your own organizations. So obviously following on from that, and with the incidents that happened in the US, Black Lives Matter revival and George Floyd, we then actually really started to think about what is our commitment as an organization to truly becoming an anti-racist organization, and then looking at what we need to do and how we bring people along our journey. So this is, I think, the third webinar in sort of the race equity series. Alex, if you want to go to the next slide. But as part of that, what has culminated from that is we've also recently released training around mental health, race, mental health and equity in the workplace. I will let our lovely panelists introduce themselves, but Chloe has been on this journey with us since we did our first webinar last year, and feel so excited and happy for him to be part of our panelists today. And we're just going to actually continue the conversation. So I will let Chloe and Phil introduce themselves, and then we can actually start the discussion. So Chloe, would you like to go first?
Awesome. Good morning. Thank you so much, Amma. My name is Chloe Davies. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a global LGBTQ inclusion and belonging consultant, and I'm also a Mental Health First Aid England ambassador. So as Amma said, I've been delighted to be part of these conversations and really pleased that we have some nuanced perspective today to continue the conversation. So Phil, over to you.
Thank you. I'm Phil Samba. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a health promoter, a researcher, a writer, like a general campaigner. I primarily work in HIV and sexual health, but I do a lot of work around mental health as well.
Thank you both for joining today, and my pronouns are she, her. So let's get started. Let's talk about race, intersectionality and mental health in the workplace. And I want to start with you, Phil, first with this question that we have. And the question is, how can different identities impact our mental health in the workplace?
I think coming from the HIV and sexual health kind of sector, I think a lot of the organizations can be predominantly white, particularly when it comes to like, if we think about CEOs or board members or people in the executive room, primarily it's a lot of white people. So if we're lower down and people of color, it can be difficult to try to explain to try to explain certain things about our identity and how that impacts the work that we do. It's really challenging, I guess. I think that things are changing and things are improving amongst organizations, and it's sad to say that the George Floyd kind of situation was the one that kind of kickstarted a lot of these things, but I think that things are changing for the better.
Thanks, Phil. And I think I want to come to you, Chloe, and to also add into this question, because I think for me, when I look at this question, there's two kind of sides to the story, which you've kind of alluded to, Phil. There's obviously the visible identities that people see every day. But then there's also the invisible identities of who we are as individuals. And sometimes when you also have that lens from a person of color, a Black person, when you're having to even just always justify your existence with the visible identities of what people see, which is the color of your skin, there's also like the inner layers. We're more than just one strand, which we've discussed in previous webinars, Chloe. So, you know, I think for me, it's really important that people really understand what identities really look like and feel like, and be actually are very much different in depending on different environments that people are in, and also the different people that they interact with. So what would you like to add to this?
No, but I would say absolutely, but also the more nuances, even if we just take the last couple of weeks and we've seen what's happened played out on a global stage of how we've seen Black bodies, in particular in sport, you know, in football, in the Olympics, that will all have an impact on when that comes into a workplace, how we talk about who we are. You know, when we see, you know, when we're talking about racism and we see the impact of that, to be someone who will have to have those conversations in the workplace. You might be, you know, a senior leader, or it might even just be conversations we're having with other colleagues, and everyone will demand to have a response from you too of what do you think, what do you feel, what's your ideas, or also, you know, in a similar setting to this, how can we be better? All of that has an impact on the person. So, you know, if I use myself as an example, you know, I've just shooed my kids out, I'm a parent, so it's like, okay, quick, you know, the impact of what you got to do, if you haven't had enough sleep, that will all have an impact on your mental health. You know, if you then are struggling, so maybe you are neurodiverse, or you have a hidden disability, that will all have an impact. And then when you start to talk about your identity in the workplace, you know, we've just, you know, had Pride Month, so that will all have an impact, because the way that we like to show up for each other, we haven't been able to do that. We're still very much in a pandemic. So all of these things, all of these different layers to who we are as individual people, and some of the barriers that stop us from being able to be who we wish to be because society says something different, that will all have an impact when we bring all of that into the workplace, because we are not always given the same benefit as others to show up in the way that we want to. So yeah, I think it's like you said, Amma, it's about understanding what does that look like to the individual, because, you know, as Black people, we're not all the same. So actually we all come with different things, and it's about understanding what those nuances are in the same way that we would understand it about other cultures, so that we can be better informed, but in the workplace better serve our employees.
No, go ahead, Phil. I'm 100%, and I think I'd like to unpick this thing around showing up, because this is actually really critical when it comes to people of color and Black people, around how every day we choose to show up and how we want to choose to show up versus how people expect us to show up. And I just wondered, and, you know, in just the light of sharing, if you were open to give an example of how, you know, some form of your identity has impacted your mental health in the workplace, but also like coming into the lens of showing up. You know, I woke up this morning, I was very displaced, but I knew I had this webinar today, and I'm like, okay, I have to do this because it's important, and I know it's important, but also in the back of my mind, I'm like, I have to, you know, I need to be focused on that. And it, you know, and I'm not saying that everybody doesn't go through the same thing, but then there's also these multiple layers of, okay, well, you know, can I be excused from certain things? Can I do certain things? And I know that I'm in an organization that supports that. If actually I was like, today I'm not really feeling it, can somebody else take over? Someone would have, but it's this thing about showing up, right? It's like, you almost sometimes feel like you have this responsibility to what's the word I'm looking for? I can't find the right word, but you know what I mean? Like, it's almost like you have this self-given responsibility, because how you show up ultimately impacts you if people don't receive you in the right way. So can we dig a bit deeper into that? And I'd love to hear both of your experiences and your take on that.
You're doing a nod.
It's difficult though. I think that, like, it's like I think you're right. I feel like we sometimes feel like we have the responsibility, and as like as people of color, as Black people, we want to do the work, and we want the work done. But also the other thing is that we want the work done right, because if we are giving opportunities and spaces in which we're able to talk about our experiences, or workplaces, or challenge organizations, or challenge people's thought process or worldviews, then we want to take that. But I think what's also important is that sometimes that can be emotionally like taxing and draining. It can take a lot out of you. And talking about our experiences, particularly the negative ones, and when it comes to things like in the workplace, or things to do with racism, or generally feeling othered, like talking, like it's one of those things. It's like it works two ways. It's like you really want to be there, you really want to do the work because you know that it's important. But I think it's also extremely important to manage like your mental health in doing that. And although we do have to some extent a responsibility to do this, to just make sure you're in the right place for it, and to make sure that you're not overdoing it, and to make sure that you're not repeating yourself. Because I think that's the other thing, is that if you're constantly trying to make the world a better place and through things like this, then it's really important to make sure that you're resting, and that you're getting that self-care, and that you're taking care of your mental health, because that rest is what allows you to be able to do that work.
100% Phil. Chloe?
Yeah, I think it's also the expectation, and sometimes a self-imposed expectation as well, because we so often are not in abundance in certain spaces. That when you walk into something, you have to be on, or if you're in a management position and you have other people behind you, you know that you'll be the example that they compare to. So as much as there've been times where, as much as I've wanted to be like you this morning, I'm be like, I'm really just not feeling this today. You don't actually, you're not allowed to do that, and almost you don't self-allow yourself to say it in the first place, because you have this expectation of either being seen or being visible in certain positions that your career or wherever kind of demands that you be that. So I think my thing has been actually more so asking for help. It's been very much a kind of, okay, well, no, just keep going, like just keep going, until you get to that point of like severe burnout where you're like, okay, actually, my body's physically telling me that I can't do this. And even then you're trying to put things in place like, okay, well, I just do one more. And we're all smiling and laughing because we all do it. Because the idea sometimes that what will be the fallout of if I don't do this right now, and that's probably where we lead with more than actually if I don't do this, because there'll be other examples where our counterparts are like, oh, I didn't feel very well, so I didn't come in today. And I'm like, I don't actually have that luxury. Sometimes as a parent, it's like, oh, is it the kids again? It was like, no, actually I was having a really bad mental health day, and that's to do with my children. But again, it's like, how do the other parts of my identity have an impact on what I do? And it's around the discrimination that comes from a lot of those that then impact the whole part of who I am. And I remember, I think I said this last time, but I remember being on a panel, and a woman said, and it was being recorded, and she said, but Chloe, I don't see colour. In my mind, everything raced so quickly, because I was like, it's being recorded, I'm on, so really got to keep it cute. I can't, like, what I really want to do, but this camera is here, plus a sea full of people, and if I react in a way that I'm entitled to, every one of you is going to believe that I'm the stereotype that's been perpetuated of what who Black women should be. And even afterwards, I just said, oh, well, that's a shame, because this doesn't wash off. And everyone was like, oh, and I was like, well, it's the truth. And after someone said, I was expecting you to like really kick off. And I said, but why? Oh, but she said, I said, but why? Like, you are continuing to perpetuate this idea of who you think we are. And a lot of times that also harms us, because you start to believe it. You also start to, and you start to conform to that. And I think that we're getting to a point where, like you said, especially after last year, there are so many people that just want to stand in the fullness of who they are, and actually we're not necessarily asking anymore because it's not something that we've been afforded our entire lives. And I think it's that part that needs to continue, but also understand how that impacts the workplace and have the space for it.
Yeah. Phil, did you want to add anything?
No, I was just agreeing. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think wholeheartedly agree with both of you, and I think that's why I wanted to bring that thing to the forefront around actually, showing up and what does that truly mean? Because sometimes when we think about, when we use the word intersectionality, sometimes I do think we use it quite flippantly, because again, we try and do this whole, okay, well, let's make sure we've got the diversity in everything, but we still don't understand the diversity in everything. So, and again, we try and do it in strands where we try and get, okay, let's find this person that fits in all these multiples. And actually, it's just about being human and understanding that the biases that we have do play into this role. You mentioned stereotypes, which ultimately, and labels, and we have seen it. We've seen it played out in the sports world. We've seen it played out in different arenas around really understanding what it truly means to be with someone's identity, because identity could be cultural, identity could be national, identity could just be the individual of who they are and their experiences. And when someone shows up one day as something, doesn't mean they're going to constantly show up that way. They could show up in multiple ways, in different ways, because again, every day brings different challenges and also different opportunities, different joys, different sadness, whatever you want to call it. And I think when we are looking at it from the perspective of mental health in the workplace, we always continually talk about mental health being a continuum. It is not one size fits all. And we say exactly the same thing when we talk about inclusion and it not being one size fitting all. So I think, when we talk about it in the workplace, we can encapsulate in a certain way because the workplace brings, boundaries of work, but you are still talking about and interacting with other people. And I think it's important to really understand the relationships that you build with people in the workplace and what that truly means, because that ultimately will impact someone's mental health. And when you put the different layers, whether it's race, whether it's gender, whether it's, different communities or multiple communities that you relate to or connect to, it's the individual that you have to build the relationship with to understand how you support them, that individual more. And equally with the groups, because like you said, Chloe, even within our groups, there are different multiple people within that, and we are not all going through their same experiences. Even us on the panel, we can connect and relate to different similar things, but our experiences and the way we go on those journeys will be different. So I think for this question, and I'm conscious of time, so we'll move on to the next one. And actually, one of the questions we're talking about is allyship. But I think when we are talking about identities, it's actually giving people space, especially when you talk about racism and when you talk about race and intersectionality, to show up in the way that they want to show up. They opt to show up that way. And actually, if you're asking people questions, if you're asking people to be their true selves, then you kind of have to be ready to deal with what that looks like and feels like, because ultimately you can't then tell someone, no, you know what, it's okay, you go back to the way you used to be before. So, I think there is something that we really truly need to unpick there, where we are starting to open up these discussions. And I think the great thing about it is, yes, a year ago, we wouldn't be talking about things like this in this way. We wouldn't even have received the support, for example, with the footballers. The conversations would be very different to what they are today. And for me, it's around how do we take the conversations to mean truly tangible, changing different things. So it's around understanding those concepts, but also the dichotomies within those experiences, and be truly open to whatever comes that way to be able to deal with it. Because as you said, Chloe, we've been in a position where we've not been allowed to, or not been supported to say how we feel. And then when we do say, it's like, oh no, well, can you kind of just tame that down a little bit? Or how do I kind of, can you give me a little bit more time to yeah. And it's like, no, it's like you either dive in or you choose not to. So let's go to the next. So we're going to say something.
No, I was just going to say, to add on to that ties into the next is also the one thing that we haven't stopped doing in the last year is educating and learning. And so it's like, how do you, the different identities, but also it's that first part that you have to go and do a bit of homework and understand and not have that expectation, because the one thing that we don't talk about enough is actually the impact of trauma. which very much comes into the workplace with everything that we do and is a fundamental part of our identities, and that we're either unpicking child trauma or adult trauma or things that have happened to us throughout our lifetimes that we all bring into the workplace. So it has to be that education part, even for ourselves, that we're educating and learning about ourselves, but for those alongside, outside. And then obviously when we talk about allyship, that piece of work is continuous, but that you don't expect us to do it, that you are also doing it yourselves.
No, yeah, and I'm gonna stand for a second. I'm gonna like, yeah, just for a second.
Sorry,
you know me.
Alex.
I'm like, no, I'm like, you know how. Sorry, anyone that's joined our webinars knows that we have a free flow, but we also like when we go into things that we really truly think that it should be shared. I do agree, and I think trauma is an interesting word and also an interesting thing to unpick. I do agree that there is, and we've always said this, that yes, you need to do the education, you need to put in the work, and it's a constant thing. It doesn't stop, because like different experiences and like different identities, the trauma of that experience is really insightful to unpick. And I think, you know, when it comes to race and racism, but also within the workplace and just in society, it's almost like the trauma is constant. It's like, you know, we have to get over, we try and get over something and then something else comes along and then we have to deal with that trauma whilst we haven't dealt with past traumas that have happened. And, you know, and I think when we talk about trauma just in the whole mental health space, again, everybody's journey and experience is different. We all go through trauma in a different way, but it's ultimately identifying it with the day-to-day, because also when you sometimes think of the word trauma, you think of a really big thing. It's like when you think about the word violate, you think of it as being a really huge word. Well, actually, sometimes that word in itself is just the day-to-day. And there are mini traumas, as I like to call it, that escalate to the big traumas. So I think, again, when we're educating ourselves, it's not about the huge impacts necessarily that you always have to focus about. Because I remember at the beginning when I was talking about race, everybody would think about slavery. We talked about the historical context of where racism derived from. And yes, slavery has a part to play in that. But then actually you think about it in the day-to-day. And that's what I think my key, I guess, takeaway from this for people to listen to is, when we talk about trauma, yes, it's the deepening parts and the deepening roots of it, but it's also the day-to-day that ultimately leads to the end result. And it's how we play a part, but also how allyship plays a part in trying to alleviate as possible those spaces to enable people to not have to relive trauma, whether it's a little bit, a medium-sized bit or a big bit. I hope that I'm making sense with what I'm trying to say, but yeah.
Yeah, I think, sorry, are you going to do the question?
I'm going to do the next question, but as I'm doing the next question, please feel free, Phil, to add to that, and we can go to Alex if you go to, yeah, thanks. Go ahead, Phil.
Actually, I forgot my point, that's fine.
Sorry, hopefully we'll come back to you as we talk about the next question. But Claire, I wanted to come with you to this first. Hopefully, Alex, hopefully Phil will come to you when we answer this question. But the question is, what should employers be doing to challenge the structural inequities that impact mental health in the workplace? And I want to start with you, Chloe, first, and then Phil come in.
I mean, this is such a big one, but first and foremost, they should be having the conversation. You know, we should be talking about mental health in the same way that we talk about, you know, employee benefits, that we talk about the positives. I think that we need to amplify alongside when we talk about race and we talk about identity, that we talk about mental health in the mainstream. And we're seeing so many more businesses now try and tackle this responsibly by having a wellbeing ERG or having wellbeing policies in a way that they didn't necessarily before, that they have mental health first aiders and they're really talking about it importantly. But I think it comes back to this thread that we've said the whole way through is to first challenge it, you have to understand what it is, and you have to understand its impact on your workplace. And that means having an understanding of your employees, whether they are visibly there or not, and understanding what the nuance, but also the barriers that stop different people from showing up when it comes to race in the workplace. So if you are someone who's Black, if you're someone who's Asian, if you're someone who's South Asian, what are some of the challenges that are going on in this particular part of society, and how will those impact on the workplace? Because what we're so quick to do sometimes as employers is to come out with a very broad thing. So obviously last year, I mean, we talked about it. I think we'll continue to talk about it. But, you know, we saw so many businesses so quick to be like, yay, Black Square. And it was like, no, that's actually not what we need you to do. What we need you to do is actually unpick and unpack what it really means at this particular time to be Black in your workplaces. And actually, do you have a large percentage of Black workers? If you don't, what are the barriers that stop that? But if you do, and there's only, you know, 1 or 2 people, again, understand that the impact of sometimes an entire community rests on the shoulders of those people, because they will be the ones that are constantly asked to educate others. They'll be the ones that are constantly asked, what are your thoughts or what are your feelings? And they're not necessarily given the space to just be. And that then becomes the responsibility of allies and others around to help uplift and hold space for those particular people. So I think that, you know, the challenge first and foremost should be self-interrogation. It should be looking at, who are you as a business? What is your, you know, what is your race equity commitment? What is your mission statement towards true equity and diversity within your business? And what does that actually mean? Because to go back to what you were saying just before, Amma, when we were talking about intersectionality, even as I said it, I'm like, because I don't want, you know, because I know the origins of where it comes from, but I am not actually well versed and well educated enough to speak on it with true conviction without reading it from the definition. There are some things that I know I have a body of work to do myself. And so when we're talking about intersectionality, in a lot of time, what we're actually talking about is diversity. And so then how are we actually breaking that down? So when we're talking about inequality and the structural inequalities, it's what is your business put in place that is historic and inherent, that means that someone like myself will not be able to truly show up. And by that, and I mean showing up, means that doesn't mean that I can't be part of your business, doesn't mean that I can't succeed and thrive. But if there isn't a clear succession plan that allows me to get to the upper echelons of the business, that's structural. That has to look at, what does it mean to, you know, to participate as different identities in your business, whether that means that I'm Black, whether that means that I'm a woman, whether that means that I'm LGBT, whether that means that it's my mental health, whether that means that I'm a parent. All 5 of those are parts of who I am. So actually, if your business doesn't cater for that, but understand that my race will have an inherent impact on all the other layers of my identity, and that needs to be a fundamental place that business starts from, that for me is a challenge, because a lot of businesses will say, yeah, absolutely, we're committed, without really understanding what that means. And so that's the place where I'm saying that education and that learning, but also as individuals, again, like that self-interrogation of, what does this look like in business? What does this specifically look like in our business? Can I trace it back from this Black person that came in at an entry point all the way up to CEO? And if I can't, where are those barriers and what do we need to put in place that means that this is no longer structural, but actually we are a culture that is allowing true diversity? And then the intersectionality piece will come along, because what you're doing is addressing those barriers that stop people from being able to show up, and you're taking them away. So, you know, I would also say, just, you know, as another note, go and speak to the people that have actually been doing the work for a very long time, and don't try and reinvent the wheel. For a lot of the times, you know, as even as individual, I'm like, oh yeah, great, we could do that, and it's like, no, actually someone else has done it before. Go, there's the textbook, go and read it. So I think as employers, sometimes we're so quick to, oh, okay, well, this is, you know, again, like the Black Square, this thing has happened, we have to react. And actually, it's about how we're being proactive to have those conversations, to go back and find those true experts who have been doing the work, to be able to say, how, you know, we need some help, and actually, how can you help us embed this so that our whole culture changes? And it's not just a drop in the ocean, because that, look at me, the metaphors, but that ripple will travel. And unfortunately, as it travels, it doesn't go inward, it gets wider and wider and wider, and it has more of a massive impact. So we really need to think about this responsibly, of take your time, really take your time, really think about, if you don't protect the mental health and well-being of your employees, you won't have employees to be able to be in your business to do the work. So it's integral to everything that you do, and should be as amplified as you amplify your other key vision and mission statements. It should be the ethos of your business. So yeah.
Thank you, Chloe. Phil, do you want to add, what would you like to add to that?
It's challenging to add to that. That was like, you know, there were so many points in there that like I was thinking about saying, but I think one of the most important things when it comes to allyship is to listen. I think there's this expectation that when it comes to allies, especially people that are maybe new to being allies to communities that they're not from, is to have this expectation of being told what they need to do, not realizing how taxing that can be on someone. I think there's also this whole thing of sometimes when you're trying to explain something to someone and explain your experience or explain how things affect you or how things like affect you from a structural level from an organization, it becomes this thing of, yeah, okay, but we've always done things this way, or okay, that's fine, but I think that we should do this. And it's all that, it's like kind of, I guess, giving up space and allowing other people to like contribute without talking over them or not allowing them to have their own say. Chloe made a point about like staff. Is your staff diverse? And if not, why is that? Why is your staff not diverse? And like what can you do? What are the things that you can put in place to make sure that you're hiring other people that are maybe not like you or that come from different backgrounds or like that will enrich your organization rather than enrich your organization, bring like different ideas and different perspectives and different narratives to the organization. And I think there's also a thing around committing to change. I think there's been a lot of talks around how we're going to make a difference and how like organizations are suddenly going to become anti-racist, but what are they actually doing and what is their long-term plan? Because I think unless you start to see changes or you start to see a difference, and then it just becomes like lip service. It just becomes saying things because it's cool. I've seen some organizations from last year become very performative in the ways of how they tackle things like race. And it's in a weird way, it's like, I don't know how to describe this, but it's like cool now to be an ally rather than it should be just something that you should want to do in order to improve the lives of other people or to make the world a better place or to just, I didn't use your power and your privilege to empower other people. I think that if we are going to be committed to making a change, then we have to be looking at that long term and not just a quick fix, not just posting something, not just like in terms of like queerness and in terms of Pride Month, not just putting rainbow colors on something. Like what are we actually doing to make like these communities, the people from these communities, their lives better, rather than just doing a one-off thing and then we just forget about it. So I think the takeaway for me is to make it long-term changes, long-term decisions, and not just, oh, we're doing this thing just so that everyone can see like we're making a difference.
Yeah, no, and I think we're going to go, well, actually the next question is very much about allyship. So Alex, if you'd like to put that question up, well, I actually just round up what we've just been discussing. And I think for me, there've been some key things around embedding. And I've been working in diversity and inclusion for a while now. So these questions that we're discussing today and now have been questions that have come up several times before. And, pre-George Floyd, pre the murder of George Floyd, these conversations and these questions were happening time and time again. And I think the key thing is very much to both your points, it's around the long term. It's around the embedding of the change, because a lot of times when people are talking about this, they're like, okay, what can we do? What can we do to do instant change? And then how does that, what initiatives, what programs, what should we be doing to suddenly create this culture where actually culture is not stagnant, it's continuously evolving. Culture is around and about the people in your organizations. They're the ones that make the culture. Whenever I talk about equity, whenever I talk about racism or race or diversity and inclusion, we are all responsible for it. It's not just on the heads of one group. Everybody has a responsibility in the workplace to create a place where It's good for mental health, it's good for inclusion, and there is equity. So coming to your point, Chloe, and also Phil, around, you know, when you look at your employee life cycle, where are the gaps? Where are the barriers? And how are you actually breaking down those barriers? And actually, who are you putting in charge of? Who is accountable and responsible for continually ensuring that those barriers remain broken? What are the behaviors that you are tolerating and not tolerating? You know, it's all right to put things in place in terms of changing policies and process and procedures, but it's also around how people interact and behave with each other, because at the end of the day, we're working with other people. So, you know, I think it's and what questions, what true questions are you asking yourself to truly be honest about the culture you currently have and the culture that you want to change to? Because I often sometimes think that when you bring out those, and it's not bold questions, but real questions, which brings me on to my next question around what makes allyship authentic and real. When you are talking about those true questions that actually will hit you to the core, and you just don't want to, you really don't want to think about it, you don't want to address it, because in some type of way, you might get in your feelings about it sometimes, or, you know, it's like, sometimes when we talk about race, for example, I've had the question around, oh, but I feel guilty. And which I ask, but why do you feel guilty? Because I'm not making you feel guilty. I'm just telling what I know and also what deems to be fact. So if you are reacting to that way, it comes back to your point, Chloe, around actually, what is the starting point with you? What questions are you being self-aware about yourself in order to know that it needs to be more than just, you know, that you need to address? So when we talk about what makes allyship authentic and real, Phil, you've mentioned you actually started talking about it, but I know, Chloe, you were just about to say something, so I don't mind who goes first. But yeah, I mean, let's talk about it. Let's be real, because you're right, Phil. I think people like us, some people, not all people, think it's pretty cool now to be woke, or pretty cool now to be, you know, on this journey. But the question is how authentic are you? And do you show up in all avenues, not just in the workplace, but with your family, with your friends, etc., etc. So, don't mind who goes first.
I think to add from what I was saying is that it's also about, why are you doing this work? Because if you're doing it for clout, or if you're doing it to impress other people, if you're doing it to look cool, then you're doing the wrong thing, you're doing it for the wrong reasons, and you're not doing the right work. I feel like what makes allyship kind of authentic and real is when people are doing it for the right reasons, when people are doing it to make a difference, when people are doing it to improve the lives of other people, or improve the experiences or the environments for other people, rather than doing it to look cool. So I think that's one of the main takeaways. And I think also something else for me is like, are you doing it in a performative way? So the allyship that you are doing, is that in front of other people, or is that is it online on social media so that other people can see and be like, oh, this person is doing such great work for Black people, for queer people, for disabled people? Is it like that? Or are you just doing the work because you know the work needs to be done? And I think that's part of that's kind of my answer for that.
Thank you, Phil. Chloe?
It's without expectation. And I mean, for a while now, and I think, you know, I've said this before, I was listening to a panel 3 years ago, and I heard Bisilimi say that he didn't like the term ally. He is no longer using it, and he uses co-disruptor. And I was like, the power of that, because when we talk about allyship, the one thing that I always question is, but what are you actually doing? You know, there are, especially when you've navigated through some corporate spaces like I have in the workplace, and, you know, and you hear that there's, you know, an allyship medal system that the allies are awarded bronze, gold and silver, but you're being awarded for things that you should just be doing anyway within the workplace. They're integral to, you know, being employed, but also to being human. So I think that, you know, what makes allyship authentic and real is the flip side of what we're talking about, is when you're doing it without expectation, when you're doing it because it's the right thing to do, when actually you're not doing it, like Phil said, for clout, you're not doing it for recognition. And it comes back to that part we were talking about, Black Square. That was so performative, you know, someone just put Black Square and the next day they're talking about, oh my God, yay, I'm out and I'm living my best life. And it was like, that for me is not allyship, because if it isn't inherent to you talking about the things that matter from the particular parts of the community that you represent, but also the others alongside you. So, we in the spaces that we're in, you can't not talk about mental health and not talk about neurodiversity, you can't then not talk about, you know, the Black Lives Matter, but also not talk about Black trans lives and Black queer lives. Like that for me is someone who's a true ally, who brings community along board with everything that they talk about, and are not doing it with expectation for their being seen to be doing the right thing. But ultimately, anyone can call themselves an ally, but a true ally is the one that is also learning. So it comes back to that bit that I said before. It's about how are you educating yourself, but also then how are you using that to educate others. You know, I would hope that along the work that I'm doing there, you know, I've got an amazing friend, Annick Soni, who's really taught me what it means to be intersex, and then to be able to speak on that. So it's how are you taking the privilege, passing or not, that you have to amplify the voices of others in spaces, and you know, ultimately in this journey with MHFA, to be able to talk about Black mental health in a way that is never often spoken about before, and to be able to do that alongside, you know, the video that we did for Depression and Me, but actually to be able to then bring that into the workplace. My expectation is for others who don't necessarily look like me to take that to their workplace and amplify it, because it will start the conversation. And ultimately that's what we want to do, is to continue to start conversations, to utilize our identities in the mainstream in as many different places that we didn't necessarily have access to before. And if that conversation is rooted in mental health, then from one business to the next business, when we talk about mental health and well-being, it will be a nuanced approach that isn't necessarily just based on what is the mainstream, which is whiteness. Because even within white mental health, there's so many different nuances, so many different layers. You know, I talked about trauma, but you know, the impact of grief from one culture to another. And so yeah, for me, allyship, it has to be all of that, and that's what makes it real. If you're looking for it to be real in everything that you're doing, like Phil says, then you're not doing it for the right reasons. But if you're doing it because it's important, because it matters, because it's you or it's someone that you are connected to, and you're using your voice to amplify them in a space that they're not necessarily at, then that's also what makes it authentic. Because for too often or not, we stick to words and labels, and we put a whole identity and a persona around them, and then we move on to the next. And it's actually not the responsibility of actually making sure that when we use them responsibly. So, you know, before when I talked about intersectionality, but I also should have amplified and said that the phrase was coined by Dr. Kimberly Quinn experience, where she was talking about, you know, a very well-known law case where a woman was being discriminated, and was talking about being discriminated not only for being Black, but for being a woman. And the argument was, well, no, she couldn't be discriminated against for being both. So it's actually, when we talk about things, are we talking about them responsibly? And that's why I said that when we can't, or we don't have enough information to, we also shouldn't, but we should go and get that information piece to self-inform ourselves, to then be able to self-inform others, so, or to inform others. So, you know, for me, that is how I can show allyship, but also the expectations of others, and also to hold yourselves, but each other to account. You know, that's the one thing I think that we're seeing in more abundance in the last year, because I'll be really honest with you, after what happened, you know, to the 3 football players, never in my wildest dreams would I actually imagined that large percentages of the country came out for Black people. It's not something that we've ever seen before. And so as we internalized ourselves, being in similar situations where we knew exactly what was going to happen, what I thought was going to make it so much worse was that large percentages of the community would not show up for the Black community, would not show up for these 3 Black players. And instead, what you're really seeing is more informed people and better allyship, because they understand the impact that would have happened. And so they're really using their voices, and it's that energy that needs to continue, not just in the visible things, but in all things. And the workplaces is the, you know, is the real life source for that, because most of us work in either in a business or where we are interacting with others where it has an impact. So yeah.
Wow, I mean, again, conscious of time, because we've got a couple of questions to go into from the audience, and we never have enough time to answer.
Yeah, I know, we
all
never
these
get to the
questions.
questions.
I'm so sorry, audience, but I hope you're actually in finding our conversation and discussion even though more helpful. And I'm not going to add a lot to it, because I think you've both actually just said what was on my mind anyway. I do believe that there is this key thing about learning, and also, you know, I'm learning and I'm always learning. And I think that's the key thing to always take away about being real in whatever cause you truly want to support and be an ally in, is yes, you need to do the work, but also know that sometimes you'll get it wrong. But it's actually just getting over that and understanding how you can continue to understand and make that gateway, use your privilege, whatever it is, to open up the doors for people that are often misrepresented, often misunderstood, and often just need to have that space to really show up in the way that they truly are and to be embraced for that. So the first question I've got from one of our audiences is, how can you discuss with senior managers that the business may not be as meritocratic as they make out, and that instead they may not be equal opportunities for Black people of colour as they think? Who'd like to take that question first?
To be honest, sometimes it's not always possible. I think there are some workplaces in which there are structural issues and there are barriers for people of color. And no matter what you do, and no matter what you say, and no matter what evidence you bring, they're just not willing to change. And I know it's kind of a negative way to put it, but it can be really challenging in certain organizations. I don't say that to be pessimistic, but it's just, that's kind of how a lot of organizations run in this country. I think the best way to be able to do it is to get evidence. If you're trying to do that, it may not always work, but I think the best thing to do is either to use research that you have, or to kind of ask around with people of color how their experiences are, and use that as a backing. But it's not always guaranteed that just because you do that, that there will make a difference is going to be made.
Because I mean, just to go on what you've been saying, Phil, sometimes you put yourself in a place of danger by being the voice. So sometimes you really have to ask yourself that hard question of, is this actually really a space for me? I think that having the data and the evidence to be able to say, look, and also to try and tie that into the bottom line of a business. I think for a lot of time when you're speaking to senior leaders, and you don't necessarily have a lot of time, and it's not the right way that it should be, but if you can show that this is having a fundamental impact on the business.
Have you lost Chloe? Is it just me?
Yes, and one of the key, but we as Black people, people of colour, more often than not, really sometimes have to ask ourselves, is this a place that's worthy of the skills that I have to bring? And not be afraid to say no, and to step away from that, because, you know, there'll be often times where we will self-tokenize by being in a space just because, you know, we think that being in a space is more important than actually that self-worth piece. So yeah, I think sometimes it's really hard to do it, but actually just to say no. And this isn't a place that's worthy of my skill set, and to move away and move on.
And I've always said that, and I think, Phil, to your point, is true. I don't think you're being pessimistic. It's funny, I was talking to a friend the other day, and we were talking about, it is real. Like, we have to be positive. No, there's a difference between being positive and being real. And you can always be positive, but the real point is that, you know, we're in 2021 now. If you have to pull together a business case to talk about what you just need to turn on the TV or Google something about, then the question needs to become, why am I in this space? Because also to your point, Chloe, I agree. I think, you know, yes, I mean, whenever you are talking to senior leaders, they always want to talk about data. They always need to see the impact, how it impacts the bottom line. But also sometimes it doesn't need to be you, Boo, that needs to bring it to their attention. It can be, you can, this is where the allyship in the workplace comes by. This is where the influential leaders in the workplace need to start doing the work. So you bring it to someone else's attention, and then they bring it to their peers. So you have to do what's right to protect your own mental health and well-being. So yes, you sometimes even have to ask the questions. If I've said what I've had to say, if it's that obvious and people aren't listening, is this the place for me to be in. And if not, there are plenty other organizations that will happily welcome you, where you don't have to struggle just to get one point across that is actual fact. So on that note, go on to the next question, because we've got like about 7 more minutes left. But the next question is, where do you think the line is drawn with educating others? I'm an Arab Muslim woman, and last summer, some of my peers were asking me about the experiences of Black people, assuming that I am not white. I have all the answers.
Wait, what's the question?
So the question is, where do you draw the line with educating others as a person of color or a Black person?
I think the line is very clear in that's not my lived experience, and actually this is where you need to go and just direct people to the other way. Sometimes it's harder said than done, because you got a lot of people coming, but I think that's one of the things that the last year has really taught me is not necessarily my portion, and the expectation that, because you are a person of color, you're then supposed to be the encyclopedia of knowledge for all things that are not white. It's the same when I said not all Black people are the same. We're not all the same. We don't all have the same lived experience. So you have to go, Google is your friend. You have to go and do that education piece. And I think it's sometimes setting that boundary in the workplace to actually say, I'm also learning, but the reality is this has happened in particular Black community. If there are questions, if you're asking me a question as another person of color, what are my thoughts? I'm happy to feed into that. But if you're asking me about the experiences of Black people, go and ask someone who's Black. And if you're asking me because there aren't Black people, that's a question that you need to ask yourself and go back to the business. And it seems, just because it's exhausting, and that trauma of having to relive and be the Bible for everyone to say, but what does this experience, so in encyclopedia and dictionary, but what does this experience mean? What does this experience mean? It's like, I'm just trying to work out my own, and all of this is having an impact on what I'm doing. I can't be this person for you. You have to go and be that person for yourself. And that is one of the biggest things that I've learned last year, is that boundary of also not speaking in places that aren't for me and in spaces that aren't for me, and actually using whatever passing privilege I have to make sure that you're speaking to those people, or at least direct you to them. It's not for me to talk about the experience of someone who's South Asian, because I'm not South Asian. I might have, through the connections I might have a lens into it, but my first and foremost thing that I have to do is to say, that's not my experience, and you need to go and speak to someone that's South Asian. So on that would be the piece that I would say, is to go back to, if you're in situations like that again, to go back and say, this isn't my lived experience. You should be speaking to someone who's Black. And if you can't find them, after you've showed me that you've gone and done a bit of work and research to try and look for the right person, I can help support you, but I'm not going to be that go-to, because unfortunately.
Oh no, we've lost Chloe again.
Which I get rid of in the first place.
Sorry, Chloe, you were frozen a bit more, but you keep breathing out. But it's okay, you came back.
Okay.
You came back.
Oh, cool.
Phil, did you want to add anything? I know we've got a few more minutes left. And again,
just one thing. I think I wanted to kind of go on what Chloe was saying about boundaries, and I think it's really important to set those boundaries in the workplace. And you don't want it so that every time something happens with people of color, that people are coming up to you asking you questions each and every time. So I think it's important to set those boundaries in the workplace, and just because I am a person of color, or because I'm Muslim, because I'm queer, because I'm disabled, because I'm this, because I'm that, doesn't mean that I need to have these conversations with you. And I think setting those boundaries with your colleagues from the beginning is one of the best things that you can do, because otherwise it's just going to be exhausting if every time something happens you become the go-to person.
No, and 100%. And we've always reiterated that the onus should not be on the person of color, the Black person, to answer your questions. We keep saying, do the work first. And also, as a person of color and a Black person, like I said, you have to protect your own mental health and well-being. So it's not every day that you have to show up and champion. And like Chloe says, if you know other people that you can point to for that, then do that. Because I think it's also sharing the platform, so you truly have those diverse experiences and those diverse voices. Because it's true, I can't speak for certain groups, I can't speak for certain faiths, but I know in my network, people that would want to do that and are fully capable of doing that. So again, it's spreading the love, for want of a better word, and truly being diverse in that. We've got 2 more minutes left, and I know I've got like 2 slides to run through really quickly, but what I would, Alex, if you can quickly go through the next couple of slides, but I would love to end today's discussions with just some high level key, just one takeaway from both of you, so that the audience can take away something. And again, apologies to anyone that asked questions that we didn't answer, but I hope through the conversation you got your answers to that, and we'll find a way to see how we can get the questions to you. But just to remind people that we will be offering a free taster session of our race, equity and mental health course in September. The date is not yet confirmed, but if you register your interest via the workplace email that you can see on the slide, we will send you further information about when that taster session is happening. We also have, if we can go to the next slide, please, Alex, quickly. We also have some useful resources links, again, which are all available on our Mental Health First Aid England website, for all the guides, the video that Chloe featured with Denise Welsh, and everything else you need to know around mental health and wellbeing. So we have 1 minute left, and what I would love us to do is end on just one takeaway for people to, if there's one thing that people need to hear today, what is it that you want them to hear? Chloe, Phil, go ahead first, and then we'll...
I would just like to say, do the work first. Or like, you know, if you have a question for someone, if you're going to come up to some, at least try and look into something first, because it's sometimes rather than actually want to make a difference. So look at your questions at least.
Thank you, Phil. Chloe?
Be comfortable with being uncomfortable. That's a place for all of us. Regardless of your lived experience, there's a level of uncomfortability with it, and on top of that, there are amazing people that are doing the work. So actually feed into what they're doing, listen and educate yourselves, and then the work won't feel so hard.
Thank you both. And I think I would just add to that is to check your self-awareness, which ties into everything else. It's like, you know, start with you first. How self-aware are you? Where are you in the, when you ask the question around how well is your self-awareness about how inequality impacts others, and checking your privilege within that, that's also a great starting point. So I would like to thank Phil and Chloe for joining us today and being part of the panel. I thoroughly always love having sessions with Chloe, and Phil, I'm so pleased that you are here. And I just want to thank everybody for taking the time to join us for this hour. I do hope you found it really useful. As Alex said, we will post this up on our YouTube website, and we will try and answer some of the answered questions in some shape or form in some way. But otherwise, I hope you found this really insightful, really thought-provoking. And I hope that it's given you some food for thought to start continuing the conversations that you've been having in your workplace, and to start questioning how you do things differently when it comes to race, mental health, and intersectionality in the workplace. So I hope you all have a wonderful day, and see you all soon, hopefully.
Bye, everyone. Have a great day. Thank you.